Good morning, Bellewood. I hope you've enjoyed your time together this morning. Know that we miss you guys. We look forward to being back with you as soon as possible. And we are probably watching right along with you this morning. So we are, even though not present with you, we are with you in that way. And we look forward to getting back with you as soon as we can. We love you guys, and we look forward to getting back. But let's get into today's message. Today we're going to be in Acts 18, but before we get to that, I want to ask you a question, right? I want to take a look at a couple items, right? I want to talk about the difference between this and this, right? See that? Difference between this and this. I mean, obvious differences. You got size, shape, right? Purpose, right? We have all of these different types of things that are different about them, okay? Now, of course, they have some things that are in common, right? When we talk about this, like this is for, right? We put things in here to keep, right? We put things in there. Perhaps this we put in our mouths. I don't know if there are things that are similar or not, but there are quite a bit of differences, not just with, right, the outward appearance. Because the thing is that when we look to something like this, we really focus on what's inside of it, right? This piggy bank, we look and we don't necessarily think, oh, that's a nice looking piggy bank. No, we think how much money is inside of that. Although with an apple, we don't often think, I mean, sometimes we do, but we don't as often think about what is inside, right? And that's one of the main differences between these two items, is that when we look at this, piggy bank, we think about what is inside of it. But when we look at this apple, we don't often think about what is inside of it. But really, that's where the difference is, right? That's where the difference and the purpose is, right? The purpose of this is to save money. The purpose of this apple, of course, to give us nourishment, but it's really to plant the seed. See, God said that he's going to give, right, when he created plants, he gave them fruit to bear seeds to make more plants, right? That was the purpose, is the seeds that are inside were to be planted to make more, right? The purpose of this is to put the money in and hold on to it, right? We've been trying to teach our kids as they've been learning ways to earn money, right? That they, we have these things that we try to teach them to do with their money, is that they save much of it, right? They save much of it, they spend some, but above all, they give to God, right? And so, right, they save much of it. And so they've been working on percentages and trying to figure out what they need to save in order to get this or to do that. And so they save, and they have this piggy bank. Thank you, Nico, for letting me borrow this, right? But, right, where this is to hold on to, the purpose of these seeds are actually to plant, to invest, to use that monetary term, right? To invest these seeds, because that's what we do. We plant them. We invest these seeds into the ground, right? The definition of investment is devoted to or given to something with the hope and expectation of a worthwhile result, right? So it's given to something. You give to something with the hope or expectation of a worthwhile result. We take these seeds and we plant them in the ground with the hope and the expectation and the work, right, that there's going to be some kind of worthwhile result of what's going to come out of that, right? And so today I want to talk about investment. I'm going to talk about investing ourselves, right? We've talked about inspiration to impact. We've talked about, right, engaging to impact the world. Today I want to talk about investing to impact the world around us. And first, I'm going to talk about investment with the words of Jesus before we even get into Acts chapter 18. I want to talk about how Jesus describes investment. Now, Jesus often talks about money, right? He talks about money quite often throughout right throughout his teaching. But there's one particular parable I want to focus on today. One particular parable I want to talk about, and that is the parable of the talents. Now, that's found in Matthew chapter 25. All right, there's a version of it in Luke, but the one I want to talk about is in Matthew chapter 25. And I just want to quickly go over you can turn there if you'd like to, right? Scroll there if you care to, but quickly just talking about it. We kind of know this story, right? There is a master that has these servants. He's going to go away on a trip, and so he takes some of his money. I say some, it's a large amount of money, right? He takes it and gives it and divides it between these three gentlemen, these three servants of his, okay? Now, he doesn't give them equal amounts, right? One of them he gives 5 talents. The other one he gives 2 talents. And the last one he gives 1 talent. Only 1 talent. I say only 1 talent, but 1 talent, right? You're talking about like value by weight. You could probably look in a footnote and see how much it's worth. It could be anywhere between like half a year's wages to 2 years' wages. We're talking about thousands of dollars that he's giving to these gentlemen to take care of, right? While he's gone. He entrusts this to them. And so, right, while he's gone, right, we know what happens. The first guy with the 5 talents, he goes and he invests it, doubles the money, doubles it, right? The second guy does the same thing, goes, he invests it, he takes it, goes and trades it, right, and he doubles that money. And so he had 2, now he's got 4. The first guy had 5, now he's got 10. Now the last guy, right, he's only got 1 talent, right, 1 talent. And you would think that he would want to go out and try to get as much of it out of it as he could. But he doesn't. He goes and he buries it in the ground. He buries it in the ground so that it will stay safe. He hides it, right? He hides this. And so we see, right, that he hides this. And when the master comes back, right, he applauds the investment and the work that the first 2 did, right? They put that money to work and doubled that money. And he says to them, well done, good servants. Well done, good and faithful servants, right? But the last guy who comes with this dirty bag of money, right? He comes and hands it to him and says, this is what I got, right? This is what I got for it. I say, I didn't lose it, right? And the man just casts him out. He says, you're wicked, you're lazy, right? This doesn't do anything for me. And kicks him out. And so when we see Jesus even talking about investment in the kingdom, right? Investment in the kingdom, he looks at how that which can be given, right, can be put to work and invested so that it can have a worthwhile result. Not just to pack it away, bury it in the ground, and hold on to it, but to invest it, to plant those seeds so that it can be invested and it can grow. All right, now today we are going to continue looking at Paul's journeys as he is traveling through Europe, and we are going to be in chapter 18 of Acts, but I'm also going to be bringing up some different parts and passages from his letter to the Corinthians, his letters, I should say, to the Corinthians that he wrote after these visits, because it's going to show us the impact that Paul had on the people that were there because of the investment that he made in this city. Okay, so turn to Acts 18, follow along a little bit there. Here is where Paul has traveled, and hopefully we can get a good map for you, right? He has traveled from, right, we looked at Philippi and Macedonia. He's traveled down to Athens, and now he's going to go from Athens, which is in this one part of Greece, and go across toward what is called the Peloponnesian Peninsula, right? That's fun to say, right? The Peloponnesian Peninsula, or Achaia, as you'll see it written in the ancient times. That's what they referred to it as. But right on this little strip of land between these two land masses, there's this little strip of land. Today, there's a canal through it, right? But back then, there wasn't. And it's just this little strip of land, and that isthmus is where Corinth is, right? Corinth. Now, we talked about like the diversity of Athens before, how it was like socially diverse, religiously diverse, culturally diverse, but there was intellectually diverse in that way. We talked about that last week, right? Corinth is much in the same way, diverse in many, many different ways, right? But they are influential in some different ways than Athens is, right? Back then, Corinth was known for a number of different things, right? They were known for their commerce because of where they were along these Roman roads and in this certain particular spot. They were known for their commerce, a very wealthy city, right? Because people would come and travel there from many different places trading goods. And so the wealth within that city was vast. But they were particularly known for like their metal working. I believe it was copper in particular that they were well known for in that region. But one thing they were also known for were the Isthmian Games, right? That isthmus that's there, they would actually hold similar to the Olympics, right? People showing their prowess and their power in these Isthmian Games. They would compete against one another, and people would come again from all over the world to come and see these games right here in Corinth. And so it was popular in that way too. Okay. Now, some positives for Corinth there, but Corinth was also popular in negative ways, right? In fact, because of this kind of cultural diversity, because of this religious diversity, because, I say because of these reasons, but also, all of these things kind of working together, we see also from Corinth is that they were well known for their immorality, their immoral behavior. In fact, there were some certain slang terms, like when we talk about Las Vegas as Sin City, right? You'll hear that phrase. Corinth perhaps was the Las Vegas of its time in that way, but even people that exhibited immoral behavior, people that practice some of these immoral things, whether it was greed or gambling or even sexual immorality, different things like this, they would be described as a Corinthian. And if you were to kind of make things bad, you would Corinthianize them, right? Whatever it was. But that was the phrase that was used. In fact, in the Greek plays, anytime a character was from Corinth, he was a Corinthian guy, he was always displayed as a drunkard, right? It was like Otis and Andy Griffith. Like he was always a drunkard. That was a Corinthian. They were like described and pigeonholed like that as a stereotyped like that as a immoral person. So that's the city that Paul is going into. Now, when he goes into Corinth, even though, right, we talk about all this immorality going on and this kind of culture that is there, he still, it says, goes into the synagogue, right? Unlike going into Philippi. Philippi was a-religious, perhaps, in that regard. But here we come into Corinth, and like Athens, it's got all kinds of religions, right? They're all over the place. And so we see here Paul going into Corinth. And I'm going to read these first few verses because it's going to show kind of his what he does when he gets there, and a couple of the people I want to introduce to you and talk to you mainly about today. So we're going to Acts 18, the first few verses. It says, "After these things, he left Athens and he went to Corinth. He found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks." And so we see here, Paul comes into Corinth, goes to the synagogue. That's his, right, that we talked about. That's the way he operates, goes to the synagogue first, and then he goes out to the marketplace and out in those circles, right? But here he meets two particular people, right? Now, these two people, this married couple, Aquila and Priscilla, or Priscilla and Aquila, right? We see them introduced both ways throughout the Bible, and people have their different reasons for that. But when he's introduced to them, he finds them in the synagogue, and they have some things in common. Number one, they're Jewish, right? Number one, they are in the synagogue, worshiping God, listening to teaching, listening perhaps to Paul or sitting, but they also share an occupation, right? Paul and this couple, they are tent makers, right? They work with animal skins, all these different possibilities here. They work with all these materials in order to, as it says, make tents, and that's what they do, right? Paul actually did this job so that people couldn't accuse him of using the gospel for money gain. And so he worked in order to fund his mission and his ministry there. But he worked with Aquila and Priscilla, right? They would meet in the synagogue and they would work together, they would talk together, they would teach together, but they also would work alongside each other. And so they had these things in common, right? Now, I'm not going to read all the details out of Acts 18, but I want to tell you that there was some conflict. Imagine Paul getting into conflict, right? Some conflict in Corinth where the Jews did not care for Paul's message. They kick him out of the synagogue. He actually leaves the synagogue, shakes his robe and says, I'm going to the Gentiles now. Ends up teaching in a school that's next to the synagogue, right? And he's almost fed up and wants to leave, but Jesus in a vision talks to Paul and says, don't leave. There is more. This is what he says. He says, I have many people in this city. What hope, right? Your mission isn't over, Paul, he says. Right? I have many people in this city. You need to stay. I'm going to be with you. Stay here. And so Paul does stay. In fact, he stays for a year and a half. Up to this point, this is the longest amount of time that he has ever stayed in any one city, right, on his missionary journey. He stays in here for a year and a half, and he does. He teaches week by week, day by day in this school, right, working alongside with Aquila and Priscilla. And so this is where we see and begin to see in this 18-month period, in this year and a half, what I call the chain of investment. This is the beginning of that chain of investment of Paul investing in the lives of these two people, Aquila and Priscilla. And the thing is that we don't see much of their story here, Aquila and Priscilla, right? They're in this chapter. They're mentioned a few times outside of this story, but from what we look through church history and we look in here, they were very, very influential and had a great impact on the churches of that area and on the history of the church in that area because of their investment that continues on. But before I get ahead of myself, right, let's look at this and talk about what happens in this little chain of events, this chain of investment, right? Over a year and a half, Paul teaches these two. He works alongside these two. They're probably in the house, right, opening their house for Paul and for the church in Corinth, right, praying together, reading together, teaching together, working together, and going on and on and on like this. And so Paul is pouring into their lives. He is investing in their lives in so many different ways over this year and a half. And then after this year and a half, it gets to this point, verse 18 of chapter 18. It says, Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. So they go with him to leave Corinth. Now in Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue, reasoned with the Jews, and when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them, saying, I will return to you if God wills. And he set sail from Ephesus. And so this is actually where we see like the end of Paul's second missionary journey. Right? And next week, we're going to be talking about going back to Ephesus. Okay, when he goes back to Ephesus later on in his third missionary journey. But here, this is what we see. Paul has invested in Aquila and Priscilla for a year and a half. Invested in them. And now he takes them to Ephesus, leaves them there in Ephesus, and he goes on. Now, here is where we begin to see the next link, the next chain in this chain of investment, right? And so it continues on here. In fact, when he leaves them in Ephesus, they begin to establish the church there. We read at the end of the first letter to the Corinthians, in chapter 16, verse 19, right? Paul actually sends greetings to the Corinthian church from Aquila and Priscilla, right? From their church in Ephesus. He sends them greetings in Corinth, right? And so we know that they have established a church there in Ephesus. But this is where we see the chain continue. In verse 24, right? Looking verse 24 of chapter 18. It says, "Now a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside, and they explained the way of God more accurately." More accurately. So here we see this guy, Apollos. Okay, now Apollos is ethnically Jewish, but he's from Alexandria, right? And he is well educated, not just in his knowledge of the Bible, but also in how to speak. And that's kind of Alexandria, right? Alexandria was an intellectual city, and that's where he hails from. And he's come to Ephesus, and he's teaching about Jesus. He's teaching about Jesus here, and he's doing it very well, with passion, with gusto. They love, right? He's a great teacher. And Priscilla and Aquila are hearing this, and they're like, man, this guy really loves to teach about Jesus, but he's missing part of the picture, right? Apollos is teaching, but he only is teaching up to the baptism of John, which means that he understands that Jesus is the Messiah. And he understands that John was there to inaugurate that ministry of Jesus. But he's missing the parts of Jesus' earthly ministry, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, the work of the Holy Spirit coming. Like, he's missing parts of it. But this is what they do. They don't go up and stop him and say, you need to stop preaching. You need to stop teaching. No. They say, Apollos, you are a great teacher. But there's more to the story. There's more to Jesus than what you're teaching here. Come, let us teach you. Let us invest in you. In fact, here is where we see them now investing in teaching what they learned from Paul into the mind and the life and the heart of Apollos. Now, and it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop there, because what we see is that Apollos, even here it talks about him going back to Achaia. He goes back to Corinth. So Paul takes these two, they go to Ephesus, right? He leaves them there. They teach Apollos, and Apollos goes back to Corinth. And it's here that Apollos really establishes and builds up the church that is there in Corinth. In fact, when we read in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul has to make sure that the Corinthians understand that there aren't two camps here, right? Right? Paul is a great teacher. He's a great preacher, a great orator. So is Apollos. And so you have these people, apparently, in Corinth that are saying things like, well, I belong to Paul. I'm of Paul's church. Like, that's where I'm in his camp. And some people are like, well, I'm in Apollos' camp. He's the one that taught me. I'm going to stay with him. I'm going to be faithful to him. And Paul's like, no. That's not how it works. No, it's not Paul versus Apollos, right? It is, right? Paul says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered the seed, but it's God who brings the growth. It's God who brings the bounty. It's God who grows these things. We are all God's church. We are all in God's church, working to invest in one another, to see that growth and to see that remarkable outcome, right? That's what we're here together. And so Paul has to teach that in his letter to the Corinthians. He teaches that, right? And so we see that Paul has invested in these two, Priscilla and Aquila, and they have invested in Apollos, who goes back to continue to invest in the world and the church there in Corinth, okay? Now, we see that Priscilla and Aquila, they remain in Ephesus, right? They remain in Ephesus. In fact, in Paul's letter in 2 Timothy, right? In 2 Timothy 4:19, let me turn to that. This is when Paul is writing to Timothy, who is in the church in Ephesus. He says this at the end of this letter. He says, greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus, right? So Paul is saying, please watch over, right? Send my greetings to the people watching over this church. And so we see, right, in Corinth and beyond and back and forth and all around, this chain of investment, because that's how investment goes, is that we invest, right? We give to someone with the hope, right? With the hope and the expectation of seeing a remarkable result, a remarkable outcome. And that's what we're seeing, is the growth and the development and the further investment in people, right? Now, how do we invest? That's the question, right? Because we want to know how we do it. We see how Paul does it. We see how Priscilla and Aquila do it. But how do we do this? I want to talk about some of the specifics, right? Some of the principles that we can see from Paul, right? How do we do it? Well, we plant seeds. I understand and I see and I know how the word seeds is spelled. I know I put too many E's in it, but today I'm going to talk to you about six seeds that you can plant and you can invest. These are my 6 seeds of investment based on what we see from Paul and his ministry, Priscilla and Aquila and their ministry, right? And I want to talk about how we invest. Okay, that first seed is economic, right? Economic. Now, you've been waiting for it, right? Ever since, right, the preacher started talking about investing and started using these monetary words, you knew that I was going to start talking about money, right? That's fine, right? When we talk about the resources we have, money is one of those resources that is the topic of conversation, but it's also the topic of frustration. But understand, right, that it has become one of those things that is important to the ministry, important to, right, the work of God's kingdom in many ways. Now, even looking back at Paul, right? Looking back at Paul, in fact, in that letter, or when we look at Acts 18, we see, and I didn't read this, but we see Timothy and Silas came a little later from Macedonia, right? And many people believe that Timothy and Silas are actually bringing a monetary gift from those churches in Macedonia to help support Paul's ministry. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul talks about this gift. He's talking to the Corinthian church, and he's talking about this gift from the Macedonian churches, right? The Macedonian churches aren't rich, right? They're not well off. In fact, he says it's out of their poverty and out of their need that they are so generous, these Macedonian churches, right? Giving to Paul's ministry. Now, the language that Paul uses, right? The language that Paul uses to describe the giving is the picture of a seed. It's the picture of planting and sowing. He says those who sow sparingly will reap sparingly. Meaning, if you don't sow much, you're not going to get much out of it, which is the truth. You don't plant a lot of seeds, you're not going to get a lot of fruit out of it. You're not going to get a lot of vegetation out of it. But if you plant and you sow generously, you are going to see a remarkable result. You're going to see a remarkable result. Now, I understand this is where it gets into sensitive, because I'm talking about your wallet, I'm talking about your money, right? And that's a sensitive topic. I understand this. But I want you also to understand that even, like, we do not give out of obligation. We do not give out of guilt. I'm not here to give a guilt trip to you, to anybody. We do not give out of guilt. That's not a cheerful giver, as Paul describes in 2 Corinthians. No, our giving, even monetarily, our giving, our tithing, our giving to the church, whatever you want to call it, is an act of worship. It's an act of worship, right? It's part of our worship services. We are actually going to work on implementing this practice more into our worship services, not just to make sure that everybody gives, but to show that even our giving is an act of worship. Because how we give, how generous we are, right, is a reaction to the gifts that God has given us, right? It's a reaction to. And so when we give, not out of obligation, right, and not out of duty and not out of guilt, but we give out of reaction to the goodness and the faithfulness of God, and we invest that forward into the work of God, then we are going to continue to see that chain of investment, right, in a real practical way. See how those seeds are planted in the kingdom, to see the kingdom grow in your circles, right? In your families, with your friends. You're going to see that in the church and here at Bellewood, in the community. When we give more and we are generous with our monies like that, we are going to see the impact that it has in the communities and for the kingdom and for the good of God and for the good of the community and the people all around us. So we give not out of guilt. We give not out of obligation. We give as a reaction, and we give as worship toward God. Now the second seed, right? So the gift, the seed of economics, right? The economic seed. The second one is the seed of empathy. Empathy, okay? Now empathy is built with time, with presence, and with listening to one another, right? We talked about this when we engage with the culture, right? Empathy is built by giving our time, investing our presence, and investing, right, by listening to each other. We look at Paul, right? Those 18 months, the year and a half he worked in Corinth. He didn't, right? He was with and working with Aquila and Priscilla. He was right alongside them, not just teaching them, seeing them in the synagogue weekly, or in that, in the house just to teach. No, he was working alongside them in the marketplace. He was with the people, with them every day, all the time. He was giving his time and giving his presence, and he was listening and engaging with them, right? When asked, like we can ask so many people, and you ask them, what is the most important resource that you have? Some people may say money, right? Because it's so important to how we operate every day. But you'll notice that more and more people, right, especially I think these past 2 years, people are realizing that one of their most precious and most important resources is time. It's time, right? And when we invest our time, we are showing others that we care. It's one thing to give people a few bucks, right? To here, go take this and get away from me, right? But it's another thing when we give somebody our attention, and we give somebody our time, when we listen to them, when we give them our presence, because people understand how valuable time is. And when we give of our time and we invest our time, we will see how that has an impact and can change the direction of somebody's life. So seeds of economics, seeds of empathy. The third one, this is what I refer to as the seed of evangelism, right? And don't let the church word scare you. You could call this knowledge, but it doesn't begin with an E, right? Knowledge. This is, right, we see that Paul, right, over and over, he's teaching every day, he's teaching all the time to Aquila and Priscilla, and we see the fruit of this when Apollos comes in, right? Apollos comes in teaching, he's teaching about Jesus, but not the entire message of Jesus, not the entire life of Jesus. But we see that Aquila and Priscilla step in to invest in him their knowledge of Jesus. And that's because Paul invested in them his knowledge of God and the work through Jesus that he was doing. And so we see here, right? We see here this chain of evangelism, this chain of investing the knowledge of who they are. And we can do the same thing, right? And it may not be us standing up and preaching. It may not be us teaching a Sunday school class, although some of you are doing it, and you're doing a fantastic job, right? Doing a fantastic job. Teaching our young ones and our adults and everybody in between, wonderful. And I love to see that investment of the knowledge that you have giving to others within the church. But we can also teach others outside in our circles, right? We can take the time to give them the knowledge, right? If they have questions, it may not look like a classroom. Maybe it's sitting down and having dinner, or sitting down and having coffee with someone, right? Or just a question from a coworker. Hey, I don't fully understand this. And you begin to teach them and to give your knowledge, invest that seed in their life. Now, you may not see the fruit of that right away, right? It may take time to be worked and to be watered, but it may grow into a knowledge in their life, a saving knowledge of Jesus. So we invest in our evangelism. Along with the words that we speak, we also plant seeds of encouragement, right? These are the words that when we build one another up, so often through the book of Acts, after Paul plants these churches, he goes, and it says that he goes around and he strengthens the churches. He goes back, he writes the letters, he goes back and preaches and teaches them. He visits them in their homes, right? And he is encouraging them. He's building them up. He's strengthening them so they can continue to work and continue to move on. And that's what we also need to do with those within the church, to encourage one another as often as possible. Those in our family and our friends, encourage one another as often as possible, right? There's enough around us in this world that can be discouraging, enough around us in this world that can bring us down. May our words to one another be encouraging, life-giving, and strengthening to one another. That's how you will impact somebody's life. You will change the direction of their life. Because our words can bring life, or our words can bring death towards somebody. May our words always bring life. May our words always bring life. The fifth seed, next seed, this is the seed of energy, or the seed of effort, right? This is the seed that involves our service and our action, our physical service and action in people's life, right? You look at Paul, he's a tent maker, right? He worked right for Priscilla and Aquila. He worked alongside Priscilla and Aquila, right? Their hands were working for one another. They weren't just talking and doing intellectual exercises, right? In the same way, we work side by side and along with other people, right? We serve other people. We give not just of our time and our words, but we give our action in practical ways to show the love of Christ to people in our circles, right? Think of some practical ways you can plant seeds, that you can invest, practical ways you can encourage and serve those around you, family and friends, those in your neighborhood, in your community, those that are in your city, ways that we can do that, right? And what I love is that there's one that's beautiful to see individuals and hear stories of individuals that are doing great things, right? And serving other people. I'm so encouraged by the stories, not just in our church, but around the city, of other people, individuals doing these acts of service. But it is something totally different and totally amazing when we see groups of people work side by side to, shoulder to shoulder to serve other people, right? I love to hear stories within Bellewood of people doing good things for one another. But what I love also is for us to see us side by side as a congregation working to serve the community around us, the community around in North Syracuse, in the Bellewood area, right? in the city of Syracuse. I love to see when we work together. Right? It's so encouraging to me, and I pray that we continue to find opportunities. Pray that God continues to open up doors for us to work side by side to serve the community, right? To invest in this community by giving them practical ways to show them that God loves them and that He has a plan for the community that's around us, right? So our last seed, right? Our last seed is the seed of example, okay? The seed of example. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul is writing back to the Corinthian church, and he says this. He says, follow my example as I follow Christ, right? He's working so hard to follow the example of Jesus, but he wants those that are watching him, those that are learning from him, those that are looking him for guidance, he wants them to follow his example as well. And honestly, I saved this for last, because this is the one that I learned the hardest this week. Personally, I learned this lesson the hardest this week. Because there was one night where I didn't react as I should have, right? I could have blamed it on being tired, a long day, all these things happen, mental energy, physical, whatever it was. I could have blamed so many different things, but the problem was my attitude. The problem was my attitude. It was inside in my attitude, and somebody in my family said something, and I reacted poorly, in the wrong way, right? I said the wrong thing, and it came out because of the attitude that was in me, and the issue, right, was my attitude, but also everybody saw it. Everybody in my family saw it. And I realized, and I looked around, and I realized that so many eyes are watching us. So many eyes are watching me and the seed of example that I invest, right? That seed, it matters, right? How I live my life, how I interact, how I react, the attitude that I have when I go shopping, or I go here, or I go to work, or I interact with my family, the attitude that I have, The example that I set is a seed that will be planted that can impact the lives of those around us. If the words that I preach don't match up with the actions that I put forth, the seed won't be watered. But if I continue to strive to follow that example of Jesus, to live and to love and to forgive like he does, right? To teach like he does, to set that example like he gave us, that attitude that is in Christ. If I seek to and I work to have that example, I will plant seeds in the lives of those around me that will not just hear the words I say, but will see the life that I live. And they will be changed by that. May we plant these seeds together. May we plant these seeds in the lives of our family and our friends and our neighborhoods, our community. May we as a congregation in Bellewood plant these seeds in our community so that their lives will be impacted. Their lives will be changed for the good, the glory of God and his kingdom, and for the good of the people and the community that are around us. Right? And now, I'm going to go back to that parable just real quick. Right? The parable that I talked about at the very beginning. Right? When we look at that parable and we look at the different reactions that these three gentlemen had, okay, I asked the question, why did they react so differently? Why did that last one react differently? Right? We could say, well, it was because of the amount that he was given, right? But when we look at it, right, the first guy and the second guy had the same reaction, but they had vastly different amounts of money. Like we say, 5 and 2, but he had less than half than the first guy, right? But he still worked to invest and double that money. He went out and he worked and he invested it so that it would show this remarkable outcome, remarkable result. Why would the last guy, why did he hide it? Why did he go and bury it in the ground? Well, the difference we see is in their reaction afterward, right? When they proudly bring what they've done to the master, and he says, well done, good and faithful servant, to the first two. Now the last one, when he goes to the master, he says, Master, you're a hard man. I know you're a hard man, right? He even uses the language of seeds. He says that you reap where you don't even sow, right? You harvest where you haven't even scattered seed. You're that kind of shrewd leader. You're that kind of guy. You are a hard man. And this is it. He says, I was afraid. I was afraid, he said. So I hid it. And the master says, you're wicked and you're lazy. Right? And he cast him out of his house and his belongings. Now, I want us to understand, right? Many of us, we don't go and plant these seeds that we're given. We're given these seeds, right? Whether they're economic, they are empathetic, evangelism, right? Encouragement, energy, our examples. We are all given these seeds in varying amounts. Right? And how we react, how we invest these, what we do with these gifts that we've been given from God is dependent on how we view him. My encouragement for you is that you do not look at God as a hard man. You don't look at him as one who's just waiting for you to mess up. Many times we don't invest our time in other people because we think, it's not going to work out. We don't have that hope of a remarkable result. We don't invest our money or we don't invest our encouragement because we don't think, right? The reality is we don't think God can grow in that person's heart. We don't think God can move in that way. And so we become afraid. Because it's about us. It's how we look. We become afraid, so we hide what we've been given. We bury it in the ground. We put it in our piggy bank to save it for later. Hopefully I can use it later sometime. But God says, take the seed and plant it. Take the seed and plant it. Work it, water it. And God will bring the increase. God will bring the increase. Pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the gifts and the seeds that you have given us. I thank you for the seeds that you have given us to invest with the purpose to grow your kingdom in the circles and have an impact in the world that is around us. I pray that we know of your goodness, of your loving kindness, of your patience with us. And so that when we go and plant these seeds in the lives of those around us, when we go invest these seeds in the lives of those around us, that we know and we have faith that even if we stumble on our words, even if we don't do it right, you will be walking alongside with us, teaching us along the way. But we also have faith that you will, as we water these seeds, as we tend to these things, as we invest, that you will bring the increase. Father, it's in your name that we pray and that we love you and we thank you so much. Amen. Love you, Bellewood.